Hello and welcome to the Dispatch Podcast. I'm Andrew Egger, Associate Editor at the Dispatch, editor of our Dispatch Politics newsletter. I'm joined today by Jon Schweppe, who's Policy Director for the American Principles Project here in D.C. Jon is a smart guy and a friend. He's always interesting to talk to on social issues. He also does not hail from what we might consider the Dispatch corner of the conservative coalition. He describes himself as more of a populist than a conservative, although I think a little bit fluid, some of these definitions. And I hope you enjoy the conversation. Jon Schweppe, welcome to the Dispatch Podcast.
Andrew, thanks so much for having me.
Your organization, the American Principles Project, is a socially conservative organization that is primarily concerned, which I think is interesting, not with abortion, but with some of the more recent social issues that have started to motivate Republican voters, issues touching some of the broader and arguably more inscrutable category of wokeness, trans issues, attempts to ban or regulate online porn, stuff like that. So I think it's probably fair to say you're a fellow traveler of the pro-life movement, but not actually a card-carrying professional member of that movement, which hopefully will facilitate the conversation that I'm hoping to have today, which is essentially just how much trouble is that pro-life movement in? So I guess I just want to start out with that sort of broad strokes question about where the pro-life movement finds itself today. Last year in June, you get Dobbs, the Supreme Court case that ends Roe v. Wade. It's this culmination of decades of judicial effort, real high water mark. Then in November, pro-lifers see America go to the ballot box, and the pro-life side loses on the ballot every single place it's directly on the ballot, red states and blue states. And Democrats see this huge boost on the issue nationally, even in places where it's not directly on the ballot. And meanwhile, at the same time, there's data that has started to emerge to suggest that the number of abortions taking place in America has not actually fallen since Dobbs, although some women who want to procure them are obviously having to work harder to do that now that some of these state level restrictions have gone in. So was the year 2022 on net a positive or a negative for the pro-life movement?
That's a tough question because obviously overturning Roe has been a long-term goal of the pro-life movement and necessary to really ever obtaining any sort of victory down the road. So I think you have to look at it as a positive in the long term. Certainly in terms of the short term, let's not forget, before Dobbs, people were looking at the pro-life issue as a political winner. They were talking about it as something that you could use against Democrats in campaign commercials and elections. Nobody was really running away from it, not to a great degree anyway, on the right. And that's changed. And so I think, that's what we're talking about here today. Obviously, the pro-life movement has to recalibrate a little bit, figure out what's next and how to be organized. But, I think what really happened after Dobbs was two things. One was that, the pro-life movement was a little bit scattered in terms of what the next step is. And I think a lot of folks, especially more grassroots activist types, were excited and thought, okay, we can finally end this scourge that's been on America for so long. We can save all these babies. Let's not give an inch. Let's not compromise. Let's go full personhood. And you see that, especially, if you look at like the Christian nationalists and some of these folks. I mean, they are no apologies, no compromise. Anyone who wants to compromise is a squish. But the reality is, because we had this kind of discombobulated pro-life movement, they approached the Republican Party with mixed messaging. And so the Republican Party wasn't sure really what to do. A lot of these folks, in Congress, or I guess you could say establishment Republicans, weren't necessarily super passionate about this issue anyway. They didn't want to talk about it. And so you just had, over the few months after Dobbs, this complete chaos on the issue. And that led, I think, to the worst position the pro-life movement had ever been as we went into the midterms in 2022.
Yeah, I want to talk about some of you mentioned the mixed messaging, and that's something I've heard from a number of pro-life advocates, activists, kind of picking up the pieces since those midterms, a lot of whom will argue that the kind of electoral bloodletting that you saw was not necessarily as bad as it looked. And they bring up this mixed messaging. They talk about the fact that a lot of Republicans ran away from the issue of abortion. They just kind of hoped other things like inflation or the border or the economy were going to kind of, that's two economy things, were going to kind of outweigh voters, and that they could kind of afford to lose voters on this issue. ended up not really being the case. It ended up being the case that Democrats saw huge gains on this. And so they say, well, next time around, we can't let that happen again. We can't let Democrats define us on this again. Instead, we need to kind of plant our flag in a defensible place. Can you just talk a little bit about what groups like yours see as like kind of what those next steps ought to be for Republican messaging on this issue?
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that the Democrats did find a extremely strong political attack. They spent, I think it was $500 million in the midterms, according to the New York Times, on abortion ads. That number is likely to go even larger in 2024. The Democrats have already kind of, said that this is the issue they really want to focus on. And, Republicans, I think, look at that and they think, oh, this is a reason to continue to hide from the issue. You even have, Donald Trump has been out there saying, hey, abortion is the reason we lost in 2022. We got to get away from this. I think the problem is, when you have an attack like, what the Democrats were saying, which is basically Republicans want the 11-year-old girl in Ohio who was raped to be forced to give birth. They want the woman with the medical condition, the ectopic pregnancy, to die on the operating table. These types of attacks are like 85% of Americans are like, get the abortion, please. Like, do not. And so when that's what we're up against, and Republicans are pivoting literally to inflation, which is what happened in 2022, you didn't see a lot of, besides from like Susan B. Anthony list, you didn't see a lot of abortion advertising where they're attacking the Democrats on their extremism or whatever. That kind of settled in. And so I think for a lot of normie voters, they did go to the polls thinking about abortion. And their impression of Republicans was that they want to ban it in all cases, no exceptions. So our position at APP, and I think other groups have taken this position as well, is you have to have a counter. That's still always going to be a vulnerability for the pro-life movement. It's not ground that will ever, I think, win. I mean, it's maybe way down the road, but it's challenging, right? Those are the exceptions are difficult. That's why exceptions end up in all of these bills to begin with. But we do win on certain issues. Like you look at the 15-week bill, obviously, is one where Gallup has pulled it. All sorts of folks have pulled it, and large pluralities or even majorities of Americans support 15-week bills with exceptions. Even the heartbeat bill, the 6-week bill, often you'll see pluralities and sometimes majorities supporting. So I think if Republicans can organize and get behind one strategy of what they want to do and really message that, and then also counter it with, hey, Democrats, like this new Democratic Senator, LaFonza Butler, an abortion radical, they support abortion all the way up to the moment of birth. That's pretty extreme. We don't want that. You send that attack out there against their attack, and then maybe it muddies the water a little bit, and you can talk about some of the other issues in a winning way.
I guess the thing that I wonder about when I hear this, and you hear this sort of thing all the time about the way that that it is possible to go out and do public opinion polling with about specific limits, about specific types of restriction, and get a positive response from voters. At the same time, you could argue that is perhaps one of the things that kind of lulled the pro-life movement into a sort of sense of unearned security going into these midterms, where maybe when a pollster picks up the phone and calls you, the median voter behaves in a certain way. But when it's actually on the ballot, I mean, it at least based on the data we have right now, it seems they have been moving a different direction, where it was not just an issue of sort of muddled messaging that caused these ballot initiatives to fail, that pro-lifers wanted to see succeed, even in Kansas and Kentucky and Montana. And this cycle, we're seeing a real push from pro-choice groups to get similar measures on the ballot in places like South Dakota and Ohio. And Republicans are really backpedaling and kind of just very much playing defense this cycle. So how do you reconcile those two kinds of data point? Like, is there something where even if you maybe have 50% plus of people in theory on this issue, they're just not showing up when it comes to actually implementing public policy?
Well, a big part of it, and we see that on every issue, you have to actually compete in the public square to win. So when Democrats are, the ones who are monopolizing the advertising, world with this issue, of course they're going to start, pulling people to their side. And I think in some of these state referendums, that's actually what we're seeing. We're seeing the pro-life message either be muddied or being outspent or both. right? And so they're in a tough situation. Ohio, very similar situation where we had Amendment 1 and a little bit disappointing result earlier. Hopefully November will go better. But again, it's all sorts of muddied messaging. I think we just have to be very clear on what we support. And that's where, ultimately, I should say this too, when you're doing all these different state efforts, you are dividing the pro-life movement, which is underfunded compared to the left, right? Completely. And so then you're in a situation where if you go state by state, the left can kind of divide and conquer. And I think they've been doing that really well on this issue. And so that's why, I really think it makes a lot of sense to make a federal argument where if we leave it to the states, which some squishy Republican politicians have said, I think we're going to lose. And so just practically speaking, you do something at the federal level, you make this a federal argument, a national limit at 15 weeks or whatever, then you can actually start to win on it. I did want to mention something as well on this, which is that your point on polling is absolutely correct. How you frame this determines what voters think. So if you say a national abortion ban, which is what the Democrats have run with, it polls pretty badly for the pro-life side. It sounds bad, right? A national abortion ban, that sounds like every abortion. That's why they say it so often. When you say a common sense limit at 15 weeks, obviously it's a little bit different. Even on the transgender issues, you and I have talked about this a lot, but Republicans are clearly seeing that banning sex changes for kids and all of that is extremely popular. But if you use the Democratic messaging and say they want to end discrimination against trans people, that's pretty popular too, right? So you just have to make sure you're framing it right and actually fighting in the public square.
So when you're talking about, getting this messaging effort, kind of everybody rowing in the same direction, obviously this is a good opportunity to pivot to talking about the presidential election because you need, right now, there is no more consensus today among Republican strategists and Republican politicians about how to kind of get everybody moving in the same direction. No more consensus on that today than there was going into the 2022 midterms. So I know I've talked with plenty of pro-life people who say it's so important to have somebody at the top of that ticket who is essentially whipping the Congress to get behind something like that. That's not really what we're seeing out there from a lot of these candidates right now. And I wanted to ask, I think you mentioned Donald Trump earlier. He has opted for a different path this time around, where you can essentially argue that he has made the choice made the calculation that pro-lifers are essentially a net liability going into 2024. Where does that leave these strategies? I mean, he's the front runner for the nomination. You think that pro-lifers probably get crushed again in this next election if there is not somebody leading from the front on this. Where does that leave you?
I mean, it's not good. I think he's clearly making a mistake here by kind of accepting this, what I would call a false dichotomy of what happened in 2022, which is basically, there's two sides to this. Either abortion caused us to lose or Trump caused us to lose. I wonder where Trump's going to fall on that one, right? But I don't think it is actually just those two things. I mean, I think there's a lot that went into it, especially on our economic message, which I thought was, frankly, very weak. We were pointing to inflation and crime and saying, oh, this is all the Democratic Party's fault. And I actually don't think voters bought that. I think you look at it, inflation was clearly both parties' fault with some of the spending in Washington. So, on this question of whether there's kind of a unifying force within the presidential race and can the presidential candidate lead the Republican Party forward? I think we're starting to see encouraging signs if you take Trump out of the equation for a second, which is unfortunate because he is going to be the nominee most likely. But certainly on the debate stage, you've seen the last couple debates, more talk about 15-week. Tim Scott was early on this. Mike Pence obviously was good on it. But Tim Scott actually got Ron DeSantis to commit to it on the stage, which I thought was a big deal. And then you also look at Trump's specific rhetoric. Now, I don't think you can look at his dismissal of Ron DeSantis signing the 6-week bill in Florida as a mistake. I can't remember what word he actually used, but it was pretty bad.
Terrible thing.
Terrible
mistake, I think.
I don't think you can really apologize for that. But that being said, if you look at the rest of his rhetoric, he is basically saying we want a common sense thing that everyone agrees on. And I think he's leaving himself open to supporting the 15-week bill ultimately. And so I think that's hopefully where we get him. Maybe he can fix the rhetoric on the heartbeat stuff. But, if we do get a Republican candidate who runs on and then wins on the 15-week thing, I think you'll actually start to see, okay, that's where we're going to go. That's where the strategy is going to be. You might actually see the Republicans rebuild the pro-life movement and start to move forward again.
Well, I will say that it is a perhaps very glass half full kind of way to phrase that, because I've talked to pro-life people who are kind of quaking at the knees that Trump will get in there and want to kind of make this kind of compromise and essentially say we're gonna essentially move to like a national 20-week standard, national 25-week standard, something like that, that would actually kind of invalidate state laws like the one that DeSantis passed. And I'm curious, like, you have these groups like SBA Pro-Life America, Students for Life. One of the main tasks of groups like this, in theory, is to force Republican candidates to toe the line on some of these issues if they want to win their primaries. If you continue to see Trump come out and talk around this issue, basically say, look, it's in the state's hands now, y'all are doing fine, or we're going to broker some compromise where everybody's happy, and he never budges from that position, and he goes on to win the nomination, does that mean that abortion will have sort of ceased to be a litmus issue for Republicans going forward?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's no question that if Trump, let's say he leaned more into this 6-week as a terrible thing and then won the general, of course that would be a disaster for the pro-life movement. But, I do think that when you're one of these groups, you really do have to think about the reality of the primary. And what's, I think, scary right now is it does look like Trump's going to win. No one seems to be challenging him. I know we've talked a lot about DeSantis, who I really, really like. But, it is, if you're looking right now, it is kind of nerve-wracking to think, what if Trump wins and he embraces this full pro-choice position? So I think there's a carrot and stick thing to really consider here if you're a pro-life group who's trying to advance pro-life policies. Certainly, I think for some of these groups to just beat Trump with a stick and try to push him that way, that's probably helpful. But, you look at a group that really has a lot of influence and spends and all of that, I think they do have to think about both things and communicating with them and trying to persuade him, right? So there is that angle too, which is how can we convince Donald Trump that this issue is actually a winning issue for him, that it's not a liability. He has the wrong people talking to him on that right now. And I'm afraid that the mistake that could be made here is he listens to those people, he hides his head in the sand in 2024 on the issue, and then he loses. And again, that's actually, I would almost argue, just as bad, because then, once again, abortion will be blamed as the reason for the loss.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you make of some of the trepidation that we have seen, even from some of these other Republican candidates? I mean, you mentioned that DeSantis, during the debate, essentially committed to the 15-week ban. He signed a 6-week ban in Florida as governor this past, was it just this year that he signed that? I can't remember now.
Yeah, right at the beginning.
Yeah. But at the same time, it was kind of interesting to watch him come on the national stage and not talk about that very often and kind of sort of dance around questions. I mean, he's been running for president a long time. And as you say, he only just kind of now has gotten to that 15-week position. And then you can see somebody like Nikki Haley, whose stance has really been like, yeah, okay, I'd sign a 15-week ban if it ever landed on my desk. But I think it's a real mistake for us to be talking about. I mean, it goes right to that strategic issue that we've been talking about. She thinks it's why are we as Republicans kind of stringing ourselves up by pinning ourselves in on this stuff where no bill is ever going to get to our desk on this? Why can't we talk about the more extreme things that Democrats want to do? Why can't we talk about these sort of broader consensus type policies? More support for mothers, more support for pregnancy centers, all these sorts of things. Do you think that the field as a whole is kind of lagging behind where you guys would like to see them on this issue, more so than just the former president?
Well, yeah. Well, to the Nikki Haley point, I mean, I think the reason is we owe it to the voters and practically need to tell them what we support. So if you leave it out there, we just want to support crisis pregnancy centers, people are going to believe what Democrats are saying, and that's how they're going to vote. But I think on DeSantis, one of the things that's disappointed me a little bit is that he did have a huge opening to really go after Trump, I would say as early as, the beginning of the year, when Trump first started to kind of make this argument publicly, or his surrogates did, that abortion was why they lost, not him. And so we need to moderate on abortion. And for whatever reason, they really didn't do that until recently. DeSantis had this line about, of course, I'll sign anything. I'm pro-life. At the end of the day, I'm pro-life. But he really didn't go into the specifics. And I think that's probably, I'm speculating here, but I think that's probably because they saw some polling like, a national abortion ban, in those words, is unpopular. People would prefer it just be returned to the states, which, frankly, if you ask conservatives, states or federal on any issue, they're just going to naturally lean to the states. And I think they probably reacted poorly to that. DeSantis has been someone where that's a strength for him, right? I mean, he's a pro-life hero in a lot of ways. Signing a heartbeat bill in Florida, I mean, that was legitimately, there's tens of thousands of abortions every year in Florida. So that's a huge deal. And I think they missed out on that. Now, hopefully, there's still time to pivot and maybe they can make an issue of it now. But we are running out of time. I mean, Iowa's coming up and as it stands right now, it's not where you'd like to see the front runner at on this issue.
I think we can leave it there. Jon, thank you for joining the Dispatch podcast.